The 1910s to 1950s have seen some really beautiful, iconic Australian design styles. On this season of The Block, we saw the reimagining of 5 iconic design styles. So let's take a look at how they brought those homes back to life so you can get some inspiration for your own renovations. The real challenge for a Federation house is to get this beautiful old home and modernise it, to lift it up to the standard of modern living, but not take out all that beautiful heritage detail, because that's why these homes are so special. The original cottage still looks sweet and quaint, but then the additional modern interpretation that's been added to the back in, that monument mat.
Yes.
It feels monolithic and strong and substantial.
So COLORBOND steel matte gives you that nuance of colour, that diffusion of light.
So what's interesting about this building is that it feels like a reinterpretation of a traditional 1920s facade, and that 1920s building is quite a respectful take on the 1920s, but the rear of the house, talk about detail, talk about geometry. That's where you get something really interesting using the COLORBOND steel. Because the standing seam style profiles have such a strong linear direction, when you start to play with the lines and directions of those lines, you get something really interesting.
And that's the beauty of COLORBOND steel in matte, is because you can see all those movements of the, the direction of the seams.
So what we've got in this building is that really beautiful, modern, contemporary, conceptual thinking around how you create geometry and how you create that detail, but in a totally new way, using new materials and new colours. I love this house. 1930s Californian bungalow. So these houses are they have quite a lot of detail. They're a lovely traditional home. Lots of people live in Californian bungalow style houses. It's funny that the 1930s sits squarely in between 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. At the beginning, we see super traditional homes. At the end, we see a shift towards that sort of modernism and industrialization of materials. So right in between, we're starting to get the best of both worlds. We start to see we have a traditional building that still has all the sweet details, but then you get large openings, you get sliding doors, you get access to the outdoors. But the best thing about the modern interpretation of that ethos is when you do a modern extension like this, because you get sweeping high ceilings, you get big spans of steel, you get those big openings where you can have open plan living. But I think one of my favourite things about the 1930s house on the block has got to be this capped, this ridge that has that lovely facet that chamfers away from the house. And again, I feel like it catches the light really beautifully. In the 1940s, the contestants were given probably one of the most hard to love homes that have one of the least amount of details, and still they've been able to give it personality. And a lot of that does have to do with, look at the rear of this.
Absolutely.
You also have a standing seam style profile in between.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting because you've got corrugated, you've got standing seam style, and you've also got interlocking style. Yeah. And I think that you shouldn't be afraid to use 3 different types and even 3 different colours within your scheme, because you can see it works. And I think that's the unifying element from front to back. The 1950s had some really interesting architecture. It's a much more modern style of building, and it actually lends itself really well to a modern extension because they share a lot of common elements, like larger windows, like some of the metal doors, and also you have those really interesting forms of the roof shapes. And I think this 1950s building, whilst it's probably one of the most divisive because it has the most interest, it also is probably one of the most interesting exteriors across all 5. This house from the outside, especially from the side of the building, is just spectacular, mind-blowing.
And the fact that it's on a corner block so you can see both sides of it, absolutely. I think that is the epitome of our lifestyle. It's really about that whole lifestyle, embracing the outside and bringing it inside.
So, regardless of the era of your home, these beautiful, iconic Australian styles can be reimagined with contemporary thinking, materials, and colour.